Welcome back to the Discover podcast, where we view faith as a discovery journey with Jesus to help you become the person God created you to be. Hey, we've got a really fun conversation for you today. I'm sitting down with a friend and a neighbor, Josh VandenAvond, and if you are somebody who has lots of questions, if you have a desire to seek out who is God and really go on this search to explore so that you can understand, I think Josh's story is going to really resonate with you. He's quite a character. He's a fun guy. So I think you'll really enjoy my conversation with Josh. Well, hey, everybody. I'm here with Josh VandenAvond, who's been coming to our church for a while, lives on the same street as I do, so we're neighbors. We wave to each other as I drive by in the morning and in the afternoon. But Josh, go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody. Tell a little bit about you, your family, how long you've been at Meadowbrook, and then we'll jump in from there.
Yeah, so I have a wife and two kids and a small dog, and we've been coming to Meadowbrook, I think, since about 2017.
Mm-hmm. Sounds about right.
It sounds right. That feels way longer than, when I say it in my head, I'm like, oh, I've only been here a couple of years. But I think it has been about 2017. My wife and I were kind of looking around for churches, and she found this place, and I still remember she came home with the coffee mug.
Yeah,
with the icon on it. And she's like, I really like this place. And so we went there. But I have a 3-year-old, Reagan, who I'm sure everybody in the children's ministry has seen running around yammering. Mm-hmm. And then I have a 4-month-old Soren, who is pretty fresh, but he's just a sweet little guy. But yeah, so we've been coming here since 2017, and really just, it's been our first experience as a couple going to a church, which has been really cool to sort of spiritually find our footing, not only as individuals, but as a couple. And so it's been really cool to kind of see that happen, get into community groups for the first time and all that good stuff. But outside of that, I'm a graphic designer. I work for an agency downtown, and my wife works for We Energies. So, fun stuff.
Yeah. And a VBS actor extraordinaire. Yeah. Somewhere on the internet is probably a video of you and me in a boat pretending to be the disciples for VBS.
Yeah, it's funny when you know people that run certain parts of the church, and they're like, hey, you're going to do this because you're in my community group.
Right.
And so being in a community group is wonderful. You get to commune with people, talk with people, but you also get roped into being an actor in VBS and all that stuff. But
it's true. You're not asked. You're told you're going to do this.
But it's wonderful. Yeah. I mean, it's hilarious. And to this day, I have not watched that because I'm terrified that I look like an absolute goofball.
I wonder if we can find a clip of it and edit it into this. That would be hilarious. I have no idea where it lives on the internet. It might not even still be on the internet, but I wouldn't be surprised.
The one thing I do remember is you kept having me reiterate it wasn't cowabunga, but it was some silly line like that. I don't remember what it was, but I had to act like this sort of surfer kind of.
Yeah.
And you kept saying okay, do it again, but really, really go for it.
Play it up. That's funny.
Which was just, it's super fun. We're in the church after hours just acting like goofballs. And, anyway.
That was a fun moment. Anyway, so we're not here to talk about VBS.
Yeah.
We're here to talk about your story. Yeah. So go ahead and, jump in and just kind of give us the background to your kind of maybe spiritual upbringing and specifically your coming to faith.
Yeah. So I grew up around the church, I guess we could say. My parents and I and my sister would go to church, but it was more of the Creaster, Christmas and Easter. I knew all the stories. I had a good scaffolding of faith, but it wasn't really... I just didn't feel it totally. Mm-hmm. And then, to my parents' credit, I got to middle school and came time for the confirmation when you sort of, proclaim this is what I believe. And my parents, to their credit, were like, this is something you have to do. We can't do this for you. We can baptize you. We can, have you do the first communion, all that stuff. But you have to do this on your own. And at the time I was like, it just wasn't there. And so then kind of led me on through middle school, high school, college, just sort of a wandering, I guess. And, I could really feel in college that I was searching for something, but it was just sort of like, I remember saying like, I'll just replace the word God with universe, that whole thing.
Yeah.
So I knew that there was something. I just didn't have anything to kind of grab onto.
Yeah.
And then in 2016, I met my wife, Emily. And so Emily's family had been going to Blackhawk Church in Madison, which is a wonderful church. They've been going there since Emily was little. And so when I started dating Emily, we just started going there.
Yeah.
They would say like, hey, we're going to go. You can come with. And obviously, it's...
More time with Emily.
Yeah, more time with Emily, exactly. And so I would go and I would listen. And, it was this sort of... I don't know. It was almost like a little bit of frustration of like, well, why did he say that? Why did this, why are they bringing this up? Blah, 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 blah. Sort of trying to almost pick apart things to try and find something wrong with it.
Yeah.
And I remember this is one of the biggest turning points is we were sitting there and the pastor was up on stage, and Blackhawk is a pretty big church. It's
large.
probably 3 times the size of Meadowbrook.
Yeah.
And the senior pastor's up there and he's like, yeah, sometimes I have doubts. I doubt the whole thing. We believe in an invisible God. I mean, how could you not? And I was like looking around and I'm like, where's the shepherd's crook like coming to get this guy? Like thinking like, oh my gosh, this guy just sunk his
door is going to open up. And
because I mean, it's just like, I guess I had just believed there was no space for that.
Yeah.
And it was the first time that I'm like, oh, like there is space for that.
Yeah.
And it was just really interesting. And so it kind of started me on this trip of just being able to ask questions when I wasn't sure. And I give Emily and Emily's family so much credit because looking back on it in retrospect, I asked some of the silliest questions that like now I view as just like basic.
Yeah.
And they... had so much grace and understanding. They were just there to answer every question. I remember I was like, who wrote Genesis?
Yeah.
Like if God was creating the earth, like, and there's nobody there, who, and like now I'm like, well, yeah, if you read like past Genesis, you realize that like, oh, it was Moses, of course. But like, they were like, oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
And like never made me feel silly or
that's great.
Like I was like this, little heathen running around, like asking silly questions that was undermining faith. They just like answered all of these questions with such grace. And man, I cannot tell you how impactful that was, because having somebody that doesn't come out and say like, just jump right into, like, well, you're in sin and repent and blah, 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 blah. And just like, oh yeah, that's a really interesting question. Like it was one of the first times that I really felt the love that a Christian can give.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, I kind of started on this. I started to sort of turn. And that was about the time that we started coming to Meadowbrook.
Yep.
And I remember like just reading through passages with our community group and questioning like, well, there's a passage where they're like catching fish and it specifically says like they caught 529 fish or whatever it is. And I was like,
153.
153. And I was like, what about that number?
We're going to fact check that.
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
Whatever it is, right?
It doesn't
but
matter.
the point of it, I'm like, why such a specific number? Why does that matter?
Right.
And people are like, it's like, if you're focusing on that, you're kind of missing the point. Anyway, so all to say, I was kind of going between Meadowbrook and going to Blackhawk, and then it really flipped for me when that same pastor gave this sermon, and I still remember it. And it's so funny how you think about, I'm sure you have sermons that you give where you're just like, I don't know about this one. We'll see.
Never. I never think that.
You're like this might be a stretch.
Like every Sunday.
But, and I remember it because he talked about, he had this cat named Calvin. Mm-hmm. And he's like, we adopted Calvin from a pound or the Humane Society.
Right.
And when we got there, Calvin was warm in his cage, and he was so serene and he was happy. And he's like, and then we went to take Calvin out of the cage and the claws came out and he grabbed the cage and he didn't want to go. And I'm, and you're sitting there thinking like, where is he going with this?
Right.
And he's like, but Calvin had no idea. And we couldn't tell him that he was about to go to a home and sit on this beautiful pillow in front of a nice warm fire, and he would never have to worry about being fed or never have to worry about, is somebody going to love him or anything like that. He would have no worries in the world. But he's a cat. We couldn't tell him that. And all of a sudden, something just clicked. And I was like, oh my God. And then he said, that's our relationship with God, of like, specifically the sermon was on heaven.
Okay.
And he's like, we have no idea what that's going to look like.
Right.
But we don't want to go.
Right. Yeah. Interesting.
And it clicked for me, this idea that started this sort of thinking of like, oh my gosh, even if I accumulated all of the knowledge in all of the world, every single thing I could possibly learn, it wouldn't even touch what God knows, what God has for me. Like, so all of that striving for knowledge, while it's good, in the end is almost futile because you won't understand it. You can't.
Yeah.
The greatness and the bigness, if that's a word, of God is so unimaginable and so unknowable.
Totally.
And like, it just was this like weight of, I didn't have to understand everything in the Bible. I didn't have to go in and say like, well, I need to know all the specifics of why this happened or why God did this. And it really, it culminated in like, oh, there's room for doubt.
Yeah.
There's room for saying, I don't know.
Yep.
There's room for never knowing. And it was this really cool moment where I was like, oh my gosh, it just like, I don't know what it is, but the theology just kind of clicked for me.
Yep.
And, then through community group and stuff like that, we read a book called Living Life Backwards, which was that same sort of thing. And it was just really great, and getting to know people in community was really wonderful. And we kind of just went through that. And that just really allowed me to sort of ask questions and accept answers, whether it was, a definitive answer or not.
Yep.
And sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to see if we could go back a little bit. And so identifying like this pastoral confession of doubt, would you say up to that point, you had your own doubts? Like, were you really wrestling with doubts, or was it just like, hey, I'm not into this and I'm kind of apathetic towards it?
I think there was a lot of doubts. I can't specifically name one, but I think there's sort of like it's kind of like when you, for a simple example, like when you fall in love, that like moment of falling, the faith, the jump that you need to make, you could have all of these questions. And I had questions of like, well, did that really happen? Did this really happen? Like, I need to know this in order to fully believe.
Yeah.
Like, I need to have empirical evidence, because when you don't come from a full faith growing up, you kind of look for that empirical evidence of why did this happen and stuff like that. At least I did.
Yeah.
And so I don't know that it was specifically like, well, I don't know if this happened, but it was just sort of like, I don't know if I can make the jump.
Right.
Because I don't know enough.
Yeah.
And so, and I was like, there's people around me that know so much more and they believe. So once I get there, once I get to this, thinking about it now, this invisible line of once I pass that, then I can believe.
Yeah.
And I think that's what it was. And then realizing, oh, there is no line. There's never going to be a line.
Yeah.
Even people who, just read the Bible, there's people that, are exalted and they're wonderful and big, and then all of a sudden they fall.
Yeah.
And so there's never going to be that line.
That's interesting. It makes me think of, there's this diagram I use with people all the time, and maybe we can find a way to like superimpose it on the screen for those who are watching. But if you can imagine like a cross, like if you just have a sheet of paper and you have a cross in the middle of it, and then you have all these dots around the cross represents Jesus, the dots represent us. And then a lot of people want to know like, hey, am I in or am I out? And so sometimes we draw this circle, this big circle around the cross, and to say, in order to know that you're in, you have to cross this line.
Yes.
And those who are on the inside of the line are in, those who are on the outside of the line are out. We call that a bounded set way of thinking about faith.
Yeah.
And then there's another paradigm that takes the line away and doesn't focus on a line and crossing a line, whether it's with belief or knowledge or whatever, and it focuses on basically orientation.
Yeah.
Meaning, are you moving towards Christ,
Totally.
or are you moving away from Christ? And that's called a center set mindset, where it's all about, are you moving closer and closer to Christ rather than focusing on, am I in or am I out? And like that, it's a missiological paradigm that I think was created by a professor at the school I went to. But it's this idea that what we want, what we have control of, is just inviting people to journey towards Jesus, trusting that Jesus will answer their questions. He will reveal himself to them, and people will have the ability to, just wrestle with all that along the way.
Totally. I mean, I think that's exactly what it was. That was the mind shift that my brain made.
Yeah.
And I think a piece of it too is, I think when you're sort of searching, the things that you hear sometimes, not all the time, but the things that you hear are like, I was in the gutter and I was homeless, and then like Jesus changed my life. And those happen. Those are great. But I didn't have that.
Yeah.
So I didn't have that jump over the line moment that you sometimes get with some of these really moving testimonies. And they're beautiful, they're gorgeous. But it just wasn't my experience. I didn't have a moment where I was like hands up, tears flowing down, accepting. I never had that. And I think that shift made me realize like, oh yeah, you don't have to have that.
Right.
That's not really, that's more the exception than it is the norm.
Right.
At least in my case, and people that I've talked to.
Yep.
And so that was a really interesting mind shift. And what you said just crystallized it in, a really easy way to understand.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know that knowing you when you first got here, it's been cool to see the growth in your faith over the years. And I think early on in getting to know you, I had this sense that like, okay, is he a believer? I don't know. Is he really like, did he cross any sort of line? I don't know. But it was clear to me that you were seeking and you were excited and really wanting to figure things out and understand more and grow in your faith. So as you look over the last, 7-8 years of your life, what have been some like really significant like moments or mile markers in your faith journey along the way? Because you talk about the pastoral confession of doubt, the cat story. What other of those moments have you had? Yeah.
So, I mean, I think through community, I've started to I learned to sort of listen. Like listening for God's voice.
Yeah.
And, hilariously, at the time when I had one of these moments, we were talking about Kairos moments. It was the first time that I had understood that. And I remember this moment when, so I had a couple situations. I worked downtown and, I'm not proud of this, but when you see certain people coming and you're like, okay, here we go. Yeah. The way they're dressed, they're going to ask me for money. Here we go. And so you just kind of get yourself ready. And that had happened a couple times. And, it's fine. Like, it's not a big deal. But I was walking out of work and I had this moment when I saw this guy walking towards me. He got out of his car. I saw the car, a little beat up. There's stuff in the windows. And I'm like, okay, here we go. And as he's walking up to me, I'm just thinking like, okay, how am I going to respond? Like, what am I going to do? And I had this moment where it was a Kairos moment as clear as I've ever had one. And he's like, help him. You need to help this guy. And he's like, hey man, my car's dead. I just need to jump. And I'm like, okay. And I can just hear in the back of my head, you need to help him. You need to help him. And I'm thinking he's going to ask me for money. Here it comes. Like, wait for it. Mm-hmm. Wait for it. It's coming. So I go, I get my car, I jump it. It's fine. It's great. He's like, hey, man, thanks so much. Gets in his car and leaves. No ask. And it was this moment. It's sort of twofold. One, it was, I feel, listening to God's voice of being like, you got to help this guy. Mm-hmm. And two, being like, see, what you thought was going to happen, like, you don't know everything.
Right.
And what you thought was going to happen didn't.
Right.
That whole thing, like, don't assume. And I think I've noticed markers in my life of God humbling me in that way. Whether it's thinking about like, hey, you believe you're a patient person and I'm going to give you an opportunity to be patient. and you weren't really patient.
Right.
And so, like, I think that's been really interesting. You know, another marker was a big marker about 2 years ago. So we had went to a different church in Madison. We had went to this church called Doxa. It's a younger church. It's really, it was really impactful. And we were there on Easter Sunday, and we're sitting there listening. And all of a sudden they're like, all right, we're going to do baptisms. And I had never thought about it before. Never crossed my mind. I was baptized as a kid.
Yep.
Never really thought that it was something that I would do. Never really thought that it was something I needed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And they're doing this, and the worship music is playing, and people are clapping, and like, I'll tell you what, I could like feel the Spirit just like moving. It was weird. It was a weird moment, but like I could feel this like pull on my chest of like, you should go up on stage and get baptized. And like, you know, there's the logical part of my brain that was kind of stopping me of like you don't really know you don't totally know what that means. Like, you should probably figure that out.
Yeah.
But
were they just like inviting people like spontaneously?
They were like, we have a certain, they had like, I think it was like 8 people.
Yep.
They're like, we are going to baptize these people. This is set. But if anybody feels the pull to come up on stage, we're not going to stop you.
Yeah. That's cool.
And I like, you know, and I mean, they're doing it while the worship music is playing, and they have this big worship group, and it's just like overwhelming. You're like, whoa. And we're sitting in the back, and it was just like a moment, which started me on this journey of baptism, of searching, you know. And at the time, one of a Christian group that I had been listening to, King's Kaleidoscope, came out with an album called Baptized Imagination, you know, and like all of these references to baptism and what it means, and, you know, like talking about like, is the water wasted, and having doubt. And it felt like something was just like speaking into me at this time. You know, and at the time you were giving sermons about dying to yourself, like taking up your cross, dying with Jesus. And something about that was just like striking me and super compelling. I was talking about this in in our community group, and Ryan Harris, who is just, I love him so much.
Right.
And if you've talked to him, he's a pretty straight shooter.
He is.
And he turns to me, he goes, I don't know about you, but the Lord is telling me that you need to get baptized. And he just, because I'm like talking around it.
Right.
He's like, I don't know if you see it.
Right.
But this is what's happening.
It's pretty clear. Yeah.
And so at that moment, I'm like, I think this is something I need to do.
Yeah.
You know, and so I started talking to Chris and going to the baptism classes, kind of figuring out exactly what it was, and just really sort of figuring out what that meant. And, you know, that was a really big marker. And then, of course, getting baptized and having people, I remember one person in our community group said, things are going to change for you when that happens. They're like, obviously nothing like from your faith, like it doesn't save you. Right. You know, it's just a proclamation, but like, it's gonna change you. Yeah. And at first I was like, okay, whatever. But then like the months after, just like the amount of conviction that I could feel about who I needed to be, like exponentially got way bigger. But it was so weird. It was just something that I had never thought would be part of my faith journey. Yeah.
I think it's really cool because I think both of those stories back to back show how like God is always present and at work, and we say that a lot. And he's present in those little moments of just passing by people on the street, and sometimes he prompts you to things, and it can be kind of scary to respond to those prompts because we can easily say, is this really God saying anything to me, or am I just making this up? But I think there's something to be said about just living in a posture of being willing and saying yes, even if you're unsure, because it's in the responding that when you get to develop the muscle of understanding and hearing God's voice, and the more you respond to it, the greater clarity you have. I'm like, oh yeah, that was definitely God in my life, you know, and or maybe it's like, well, maybe that wasn't God, but hey, at least I got to help this guy jump his car, and in the process, you're surprised along the way because you never know what God's up to. And I think that's what makes engaging in those moments so exciting, specifically the little moments, because they happen all the time. It's just a matter of whether or not we're aware of them.
Yeah, I think that's really what it is like having the retrospect to look at it and be like, did I over spiritualize that? Or like, is that really something that pulled me towards God, pulled me towards the things that Jesus talks about? And, that's really where it comes to light. And I find that, like, when you look back on it, and even like this process of thinking through your story, thinking through my story, it just becomes so much more vibrant.
Yeah.
When you start thinking about those moments, it's like they become less of like markers and more like beacons.
Yeah.
They illuminate a bit more. And I think God does that purposely. He sort of says like, hey, remember this because this is where I was speaking. This is where I was talking.
Yeah.
Where, sometimes you're like, I think God is pushing me towards that. And you do it and you're like, yeah, maybe not. Or, there's always the thing of like, I think this is it. And then it doesn't turn out how you think God was trying to push you. Right. And then there's something to learn in there. But anyway, it's been a really interesting process to really just tune my ears to listen a little bit more and also just be humble when I'm wrong.
Yeah. And I think too, like we talked about, I think just this last Sunday in service that like there's this idea of having an adventurous life with God. Yeah. And it's like you get to be a divine detective alongside God, like trying to figure out where is he at work and where do I get to partner with him in the work that he's doing? What is he putting in front of me to engage with what he's doing in the world? So let's talk about like where you're at right now today in this current season and how you're finding God is teaching you in real time in your daily life.
Yeah. Thinking back on this as I was preparing for this and thinking through it, the thing about it is I have a 3-year-old and a 4-month-old. Mm-hmm. And I've just started to have this realization that so much of what the relationship that we have with God and what he has to teach us about that is in parenting.
Yeah.
And, I've been the phrase dying to myself, dying to yourself, that idea, not only in baptism, but the ego death of like, this isn't about you. You have to serve this 3-year-old. You have to give up these things in your past life that you would normally do. You have to give up all of this. You have to put that aside to serve somebody else, to pour yourself into somebody else. Mm-hmm. I think that's what we do as parents with kids is we want to pour every ounce of our being into these little children. And so there's been so much to learn in that, whether it's unconditional love of like, even in the sort of microcosm of I love my kids so much. And specifically my 3-year-old will push against me and rebel and scream at me. And there's like no amount of screaming that can make me not love her. But, I see the like almost original sin there of like her rebelling against me. And I'm like, you don't even understand how much I love you.
Right, yeah.
And, I joke with my wife that I'm like, and this is going to sound bad when I originally say it, but you'll get what I mean. So when you find your partner and you get married, you believe that you love them, and you do.
Yeah.
And then you have kids, and it's as if like a whole new like game level opens, and you're like, oh, I'm starting. Like I thought that was love.
Yep.
And now this whole other like meter just filled up that I'm like, oh my gosh, this is unreal.
Somebody once said that to me about their kids, and they framed it in a way of like, if something were to happen to my husband, I can like understand how I could move beyond that, but if something were to happen to my kids, I don't know how. And I was like, that's a really weird thing to say. And I didn't have kids at the time, and then I had kids, and I'm like, oh, I get what she's saying, because there's something different, and like you get to choose your partner, you have like, but like your kids is just like literal this gift. Oh
my gosh.
And it's crazy,
and even the fact of like going through my wife's pregnancy and then, being there when they're born, you realize how little control you actually have.
Totally.
And so there's like this death of control, this death of ego of like, I'm not really that important anymore. Like I want to pour all of myself into these kids and retain my marriage, because without my marriage, my kids, there's just all these things that you just learn, or I've been learning about our relationship with God that I think have been illuminated to me through parenting.
Yeah. So we talked about Kairos moments, and you named one earlier, specifically helping this guy jump his car. Yeah. Can you think of any specific Kairos moments in recent weeks or months with parenting, and like how God has revealed something to you through the relationship with your kids? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, I know. You're putting me on the spot, and now I'm trying to think because I'm just like, man, the last week has felt like we joke that I'm like, wow, this has been a long year.
Yeah.
And it's like we're in February.
Right.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good example. Okay, here's one that happened actually really recently. So a couple that were back to back. So not this past Sunday, but the Sunday before, we were at service. It ended, and I went and got my daughter from the children's ministry, and I came back up, and my wife just like sobbing, and I'm like, oh no. She had gotten a call that her grandmother had passed away, and I was like, there was a part of me that was sort of torn. Because I'm like, this is horrible. But I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the best place to be.
Yeah.
And so in that, this Kairos moment, so I remember like, I have to go get the car.
Yeah.
And I have to leave her. But I'm like looking around and I'm like, anybody that she knows, like we need comfort now. And just thinking like, oh my gosh, we're in the perfect place for that. And so like, I knew like we had to move.
Yeah.
So I was like, I just got to go. And I didn't have time to, hey, could you go over and talk to my wife? But as I came back, I see through the window that one person that my wife is really connected through our community group was standing there consoling her. And I'm like, oh my gosh, just like that moment, that little moment was just like this perfect timing, right? Of learning this terrible news, but being in the perfect place.
Yeah. So we talk about Kairos moments being like how you find them and you identify them is usually through disruptions, right? So talk about a major disruption of losing a loved one, and sometimes it's hard. And we say it's not that God causes these disruptions, but He's in it with us, and so that's I think the key to identifying them is finding where is God at work in this disruptive moment. Because usually in disruptive moments we just want to react, we want to control, we want to manipulate.
Totally.
And I think what we're talking about is trying to find a way to surrender our life so that we can again participate with God and what He's doing, and not that like you have to like participate with Him in that moment of getting this news, but to have awareness of where and how God is at work in these moments with the connection of people and the idea of like, hey, we're in the right place because there's all these people who love us and care for us. And
it really gives you a framework of response when you're able to recognize them quicker.
Yeah.
It gives you a framework of like, okay, I need to respond appropriately. How do I respond? Like, because if I say, hey, God is working in this moment right now, how are you going to respond? Then you're not going to be like, well, I'm going to kick and scream and fight and blah, 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 blah. Like, that just sounds ridiculous to a logical brain. So you would obviously be like, oh my gosh, if God is really working in this moment, I should respond with love and obedience and, all of these different things. And so I think in that one, just because we had been talking about it, it was top of mind. I was like, oh, this is what I need to do. And then the other one that kind of just folded in right there with it is trying to explain to our 3-year-old what had happened.
Yeah.
And she had this wonderful, beautiful moment. Man, like experiencing faith through a 3-year-old's eyes is unbelievable. And she had this moment where she was like, so is Grandma at the hospital? And we're like, well, no, she's gone. She's in heaven. Oh, with Jesus? We're like, yeah. She's like, so Grandma's in heaven with Jesus? Yeah, okay. Will I go to heaven? And we're like, yeah. And she's like, oh, good, because I want to see Grandma. Like it sounds so silly, but you're just watching. Yeah. It's almost like you're visually seeing the cognition and that faith happening where she's, and like, it's just so funny because I think, me as a person, like I'm probably similar to you in the way where like, I love the intricacies and the logical, nature of the Bible and like how you can kind of like dissect faith and sort of see the mechanics of it. And then you hear this 3-year-old be like, so if this happens, then I do this. And you're like,
it's that simple.
I'm like, yeah, like, you know this better than I do.
Right.
And so like, those have been just some really beautiful moments that like, you just see God working in tragedy.
Yeah.
and in the wake of something terrible like this happening.
Yeah.
You can just see those moments, and it's really cool to see that. And then of course going to a funeral and seeing people really come together, and seeing family like put down swords and just commune with each other and sitting there talking and reminiscing. Like, you just really feel God's love at work there. And so I don't know. I mean, those have been the most prominent Kairos moments in the last 2 weeks that have just been like right there in front of us.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, this has been a really great conversation that I think shows the kind of the dynamic of what it means to discover God, to learn how to walk with God, to bring others into your relationship, namely your kids. And as you do that, I mean, a lot of what we've been talking about is like not like a over the top adventurous sort of like monumental things, but it's a really what I would characterize as an exciting life because you're on this journey of exploration to understand God more, understand yourself more, and to have all of these wonderful relationships with people who are on that journey with you. And I can't think of any other way I would want to live my life.
Yeah. And it's been so interesting too, because then, so that's sort of like my family kind of communal aspect of engaging in that. But like, just in my own head, there's been this interesting sort of facet that's opened up to me. And, I listen to a lot of podcasts throughout the day, listen to a lot of YouTube videos, and just like seeing how God is working in like these bigger names, whether it's, even if you've heard of Wes Huff, is that his name? He was on Joe Rogan's podcast talking about the gospel and talking about why you should believe the Bible. And I'm like, this is going out to like millions of people.
Yeah.
And seeing like these skeptics turn towards faith, whether it's Russell Brand or anybody like that, or, I recently got into Phil Connectley.
Okay,
his name?
Yeah.
Which like is hilarious because I watch these videos. I'm like, these are from the 90s.
Yeah.
And watching, this person with grace, but also fortitude go and on these college campuses. For those that don't know, he goes on college campuses and essentially lets any college student ask him any question and responds. And being able to kind of get into apologetics and really sort of figure out like how do I answer that?
Yeah.
So when somebody says like, why do you believe this? Like, well, that's not true. How do you know that's true? That I have sort of a framework to respond outside of just like, well, I know it. And like God is in my heart. Because, I think like God meets people where they're at.
Totally.
And like, I think sometimes as Christians, we want to sort of say like, this is the fullness of Christianity. But I think sometimes people are just like, well, I don't even know if I believe in God. And it's like, okay, let's start there.
Right. Totally.
And let's go from there. And so, it's been this really interesting ride of just like having this sort of faith piece that I talked about with the Calvin the Cat story of letting go, but also growing this intellectual side and allowing these sort of apologetical arguments to kind of take root and to let them kind of come through. The Bible Project is another great example of sort of researching and understanding like, oh my gosh, does this story in the Bible really mirrors the Noah story? And oh my gosh, they're using the same words. And like, just fascinating how the Bible becomes so much bigger once you take the plunge.
Yep.
It's 66 books?
Yep.
Almost got it. 66 books, but it feels so much bigger once you start to kind of go into it and you're like, oh, this is over. The Eden story is completely overlaid the like Abraham story or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Don't check me on that. And so that's been a really interesting kind of thing to sort of realize is all these different ways that you can engage with God. You can have the sort of letting go, the faith aspect, God being unknowable, but only knowable through Jesus, and all these things of like, wow, that's a leap.
Yeah.
But also have these like intellectual things of like, well, what did they mean? What did the time frame mean? And all that different stuff. And so that's been this really interesting journey to grow my just my knowledge of it and kind of seek that out. And so that's been just a fascinating portion that I can feel more and more God consuming my mind throughout the day.
Yeah.
That's great. And so it just really interesting and makes me more hungry to kind of learn.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, this has been fascinating. I think people who are listening will resonate with a lot of your story, with the different steps along the way through discovery and growing in faith. And so one of the ways we end is just by saying to people who are viewing or listening, like if they see you around church and they want to talk to you, there's probably an open invitation from you just to come chat, because knowing you're a really kind, personable guy, you would love to engage with people, and how your story has either sparked something in them or impacted them. So thanks for being here today and just sharing all that with us.
Yeah, I'm a very talkative person.
Yeah.
You couldn't tell. That's been something I've been trying to work on, is taking a back seat to the ego death, all that different stuff.
Listening to God and listening to others is anyway.
And so I enjoy talking. So anybody that likes to talk about anything that I just talked about or not,
come find you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks for being here.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.